Khalil is the son of two Islamic converts. He's an African American that left Islam about a decade ago. He's had quite the journey. He spent some years in Saudi as a teenager and then even spent time studying Arabic in Medina. He's been really quiet about his story thus far, and this is the first time he's coming on camera to speak about his journey and reflect on the movement. His story is really interesting and he shares some apt reflections on Islam. Please join me in welcoming him. Hi, everyone. Today I'm joined by a friend of mine who goes by the name of Khalil. I've known Khalil probably for over a year now online. We've been buddies, we've talked a lot, and I think Khalil has a very interesting story. He's doing something he's never done before, which is he's coming on camera and talking about his story and what happened, how he ended up where he is today on the side of the heathens, the disbelievers, ex-Muslims. Now, Khalil, how's it going? We're in the middle of right now a bit of a crisis all over the world.
Yeah. I guess the good part about the crisis is that it gives us a little bit more time to do things like this, which is useful. So
Yeah.
you got to find the bright side of everything, I guess.
Definitely. So you're in America. You were you born in America and grew up in America? I guess you've been there your whole life, pretty much.
Yeah. So I am an American. I'm African American. I was born and raised in the United States. I did spend a significant portion of my life in the Middle East, but we can get to that another time. But yeah, I'm American by birth, Muslim by birth as well. So, my parents converted to Islam before I was born and they had their own journey. So in a lot of
Both
ways,
your parents, eh? Mom and dad both are converts.
yeah, both of my parents converted to Islam before I was born. So,
In the
Islam.
80s, before the 80s, when did they convert approximately?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my mother actually, and it's two different stories, so it might help if I told them both separately.
Mhm.
My mother converted to Islam initially through the Nation of Islam, which
Oh.
many people may have heard of. Influential people like Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad, and there was a big organization, and I think a big awakening, especially amongst African Americans. In the '60s and the '70s, and in some ways up until the '80s, even though things began to change in the '80s with the Nation of Islam in particular. Um, in 1975, I believe the year was, the founder of the Nation of Islam died. And it put the organization itself into a lot of turmoil. So you had, people jostling for leadership positions, you had people breaking away. And I think significantly, you had his son, Warithuddin Muhammad, W.D. Muhammad, as he's
Mhm.
often called. He led a group of people into more mainstream Sunni Islam.
Mm.
And through that process as well, not necessarily directly through his leadership, but my mother and many of the people that I grew up around and many of the people that I know, they were introduced to various strands of Sunni Islam through that process. So I remember being really young, and some of the masjids that we would go to originally in my city were actually formerly Nation of Islam temples that were
Oh,
converted into,
no way.
yeah.
Oh, they converted them into masjids.
Yeah, they converted them into a masjid, and that's pretty common.
Oh,
That's
no.
happened quite a lot. And I think, I grew up on the East Coast of the United States, and throughout that entire process, there was more and more exposure to Islam, right? So I remember some of my earliest memories are actually with family friends that were Pakistani, for example. So I remember Eid and eating biryani and those kinds of things, and it was normal because it's all I knew. There were also really heavy influences from Arabs. So, for example, lots of students that came from Saudi Arabia. When the Gulf War happened, there were lots of, not necessarily Kuwaitis, but Palestinians, for example, who had lived in Kuwait and then they came over to the United States. And I remember
Mhm.
going to their houses and playing with their kids and so on and so forth. So, the community that I grew up in was very cosmopolitan in a way, very multicultural. And the uniting factor most definitely was Islam. So, Islam was the thing that glued everything together. My dad's a little bit different, and my dad actually passed away when I was really young, so I don't know much about him apart from what I've been told.
Oh,
But
okay.
my dad was, he was in the Navy, and he traveled a bit. One of the places that he lived in for some time was North Africa, and he was influenced, I think, partly from his time there. He also read a lot, and he ended up converting as well. So the interesting thing about this story is that the two of them actually met initially in Mecca, making Hajj. My mother had been
Wow.
before. My dad, I don't know if he had been before or not, but yeah, that's when they first met.
That's not haram in any way, eh? Meeting at
Well,
Hajj.
They were in the same group. I don't think anything happened. They were in Ihram, so I don't think anything happened there. But they were in the same group, and I think from there they kind of like kept in touch and that kind of thing. So
Okay.
yeah.
Oh wow, wow. So then you were raised as a religious Muslim in the sense that your family was very practicing. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. After my dad passed away, I think, Islam gives a lot of hope to people dealing with, death and that sort of thing. And the idea that you're going to see your loved one again is an attractive idea, not just in Islam, in all religions, or all religions that believe in an afterlife. This idea that you'll have the opportunity to see, that loved one again was a big theme growing up. So, there's a hadith that, there's people that I don't remember the number at this stage, but, there's 3 people, I believe it is, whose actions are going to be continued on after they're dead. And one of them is waladun salihun yad'u lah, like a righteous son that's going to make dua for him, that's going to pray for him.
Mm-hmm.
So in a lot of ways growing up, I had that pressure on me that, hey, don't remember, you have to make dua for your father. You have to pray for your father. So there was always that thing, hey, you can't do that. You've got to be a good person, like those kinds of things. So Islam was definitely a huge thing growing up. And in a lot of ways, it's easy to look at it and say it's childhood indoctrination. But in other senses, it's also childhood memories, right? So, like I mentioned earlier, Eid and playing around and dressing up nicely. Those are all good memories too. So there's the good and the bad. I think in any religious tradition, Islam is no exception.
Mm-hmm. So when you were raised as in America as a Muslim, obviously you were a minority, I guess, growing up as a Muslim, Black Muslim in America. And how did you feel like being that? Did you feel like you were the odd one out at all in any sense, or were you like, was it Islam now? I think is much more common, and things have changed a lot from when you grew up as a Muslim till now.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering how you've seen that things have changed from when you were young growing up in America as a Muslim compared to now.
That's a really great question, actually. There are definitely changes, for sure, 100%. And I think a lot of what you just mentioned about being the odd one out, I think that kind of came with the territory. You're talking about the 80s and the 90s and, growing up with this weird religion and, not celebrating Christmas and not eating pork and, all those kinds of things that, the kids in your neighborhood are doing that you can't do. It definitely makes you a different, even just my name, having an Arabic name and having this name that is not like Tim or Corey or something like that. So those things make you stand out and you're different. At the same time, though, even though Islam was such a big part of our lives, I think because I was African American, there was still that connection. So I still had aunts and uncles that were Christian, for example. So I know about those things.
Yeah.
I know about Christmas. I know about the Bible. I know about church. And my family on my mother's side is actually extremely religious, period. So my mother's side of the family, a lot of them are really involved in the church. And my grandfather actually was a preacher down in Georgia.
Oh, wow.
So Islam was a transition for my family, my mother specifically, out of Christianity. But it still had a certain flavor to it that wasn't exactly what I found later in life when I went and lived in the Middle East, So going through that transition. Mm-hmm.
What happened in the Middle East? So you actually told me you went to at one point Mecca. Was it Egypt as well? Or?
No, yeah. So I actually, yes, I studied at the Islamic University in Medina for some time. I've been to Mecca. I traveled to Mecca a lot just because, I was there and I wanted to take advantage of making Umrah, and there were different mashayikh at the time that scholars that I would sit with in Mecca as well. So I traveled to Mecca quite frequently.
That was as an adult now.
Right? That was as an adult, yeah. So I first went to Saudi Arabia as a teenager. And a lot of times, a lot of ways, I guess I would say my formative years were spent there. So, that time when you're transitioning from adolescence into adulthood, you think you're an adult, but there's a lot you still don't know about it. That happened in the Middle East. And in Saudi Arabia in particular, and this is no surprise to anyone, Islam is such a pervasive part of the culture. So I'll just give you this example. This is an example I like to give sometimes to demonstrate. So, for example, I remember the first time when I fasted Ramadan. Maybe it was my first or second year fasting. I was, around that time when you have to do it.
Okay. Yeah.
And this is the time when Nirvana was pretty big as a as a
Okay.
band.
Yeah.
So for me, every time I hear the song "Smells Like Teen Spirit," it reminds me of Ramadan. Because throughout the day we weren't allowed to listen to music, but at night I was like, all right, it's time to party. We can listen to music.
Oh, that's
So,
funny.
those are things that as an American you really don't see a problem with.
Yeah.
But in Saudi Arabia, there were people I knew that, and even me, I became that religious that I didn't listen to music at all.
Hmm.
In Medina in particular, you don't really hear music like that,
Oh, yeah.
like in the supermarkets and just going around. You don't hear it. It's not as big a part of your life.
Yeah.
So for me growing up, the idea that music would have been haram was foreign,
Hmm.
kind of. You hear about it, but like it's like no one's really going to take that seriously. And then, once I got into those years, no, people really do take it seriously. And not only that, but a lot more. That's one example. But more generally, I think Saudi Arabia it's a different culture. It's a very different culture. And Islam is very weaved into that culture.
Hmm.
As a Muslim, some of those things were good
Yeah.
because you don't feel as much as an outsider. You kind of feel like, oh, I'm more comfortable. I can be, this practicing Muslim that I want to be.
Yeah.
But you also start to gain an appreciation for the freedoms that we take for granted in the
Oh,
West,
yeah. Hmm.
and for our system of equality, our system of
Oh, yeah.
the
I
rule
want to
of
ask
law.
you about that. Yeah, I want to ask you about like, did you feel any racism being, a black man in Saudi? What was it like? I've been to Saudi myself for
Mhm.
Umrah, and I felt, I mean, just from just the one time I went there, I felt like they looked down on other people a lot. Like it just
Mhm.
even you just saw the way they talked to like brown people. Like it just seemed very dismissive. I mean,
Mhm.
it was weird. As like I said, coming from Canada, nobody acts like that towards another like race or culture, whatever. It's just everyone's the same, right? I mean, some people are assholes here too, no doubt. But over there,
Exactly.
it seemed like it was like part of the system
It's
there,
part
right?
of it. Yeah, it's the way. So it's really interesting you ask that, because when I was in Saudi Arabia, I was very religious, and I actually had a pretty big beard. I think it was probably second only to the beard that you had. And I would usually dress in, the Saudi garb, especially because I was a student. It's impossible to think of a student in
Yeah,
Medina walking around just in like jeans and a
yeah,
t-shirt or something
yeah,
like that. You're
yeah,
wearing a thobe, you have your Saudi shamal and all that stuff, and that's what I
yeah,
wore on a regular basis.
yeah,
So, and I personally, and because I'm not the darkest African American,
yeah.
I actually didn't feel that sort of disrespect that you're talking about.
And
But
you speak
where
Arabic fluently.
I can, I could speak Arabic
Yeah,
fluently. I'm sure that my accent would probably give me away because I'm sure I have an American accent when I speak it. But yeah, people recognize me more as a mutawa, like, this
yeah, yeah,
religious
yeah.
guy,
The religious police.
than exactly than anyone else. But the thing that really did get me, so I grew up in the South, and one of the probably the more impactful things that I remember about my childhood is a field trip that we took in third grade. We went to a slave plantation, and we saw where they kept the slaves. We saw the things that they used to torture the slaves.
In
We
Saudi.
know in America.
Oh, okay, in
So,
America. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. I
yeah.
was thinking that's weird. Like what?
No, 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 no,
Saudi
no.
wouldn't
So
show
we'll
that.
come full circle with this story in a minute. But yeah, I saw slavery. And obviously growing up and, having parents that were in Nation of Islam and being African American, you had this idea of slavery and what it was all about and how they were literally not treated like humans. But to your point, because no one really is that extreme anymore, I didn't really process how it worked. Like
Oh,
I didn't know how you could treat another human being that way. I understood it, but it
yeah.
didn't really click.
It was like book knowledge, right?
Exactly. Not
Yeah,
only book knowledge, but something that you just can't really, like Nazism, right? You
yeah,
don't understand how they
yeah,
gassed 6 million Jews.
yeah.
You can't comprehend. It's like
Crazy.
what? But when I went to Saudi Arabia and I saw the way that they treated the South Asian workers there,
Yeah,
the complete lack of dignity, the lack of respect. Literally, I've heard them call people what a like boy,
yeah.
a grown man,
Oh, yeah,
probably older than you, calling you a
yeah,
boy. And I'm like, oh wow, that's it. Like this is it. This is the
yeah.
thing. So this idea of inequality, you see it there. The thing that really got me was the way that it was geared towards the people that came to serve them, the
Mm,
South Asians specifically, and by extension, folks from Philippines and that sort of thing. So it was unsettling, and
mhm.
you do see it as well. Even in Mecca, you see, for example, you see beggars on the side of the streets. You see these folks that appear to be of African descent, dark
Yeah,
skinned. I remember once I saw an old lady that was just like eating out of a trash can.
Wow. Yeah.
You know, and this is in Mecca too, right? So like if
Yeah.
you have this idea that Mecca is this great holy city where things are good, and you get there and it's not. I mean, it has significant issues.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, isn't that something that many Muslims have? Like, many Muslims have this sort of like sanctified, sanitized, impression of Mecca. And then, a lot of times when they go there, they're shocked that like kidnappings happen and stuff like that. It's just, it doesn't click in your mind because you feel like, that shouldn't be happening. There's angels here, and there's like,
Yes, exactly.
like the prayers are worth like 1,000,000 times. The tomb of the prophet is here. Yet there's like, I was shocked myself when I went to Saudi, and okay, this is a funny thing. We went to Egypt, we went to Kenya, we passed to Ethiopia, and we went to Saudi. And out of all of those places we went, the Saudi like officers were the ones asking me for the bribe. Like, nobody else asked me for the bribe. But
That's interesting. I never ran into that. I never got asked for a bribe or anything like that in Saudi Arabia.
Oh, this is what happened.
But
They told us, you have baby food. And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, you're not allowed. I'm like, it's sealed. It's sealed. And then we had kids, right? They're like, no, 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 no. And then they're like, for loose, right? I was like, and I knew what they meant. They wanted money, but I pretended I didn't know. I was like, what's that? They got so frustrated, like, just get out, just go.
Just go. Yeah, and here's the thing. I mean, there's always good and bad in every situation. And I try to think about that, especially now, because it's not like my time in Saudi Arabia was all terrible. I mean, it's an incredible country just from the standpoint of its history and how different it is to what I was used to, and the people that you get to meet, and you meet incredible people, individuals, not just the broad society. You meet incredible individual people. So I can't paint it all with one brush of saying it was good or it was bad. But back to the point that you were making about how so many Muslims have this romanticized idea of Mecca, I think that's part of the problem, right? Because you're just seeing this one image of the Kaaba that you've been seeing your whole life on prayer rugs and in pictures, and it's just this magical place where things are good, and that's not the case at all. It's the earth. It's a city just like any other city. It's got taxi drivers and trash and beggars and criminals and prostitutes, and anything else that happens in a city happens in Mecca.
Oh wow, so, that's too.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, it's normal though. You have humans, and I think that's really the thing that probably, there are a lot of things that went into it, but you start to understand that human beings are human beings. Wherever you are, people are people, and a lot of the symbolism behind Mecca is generated in your own mind.
Yeah,
you create that magical aura. And I was having a conversation with a friend of mine online about this very topic, because it's true. If you're a believing Muslim and you go to Mecca or you go to Medina, and you're praying there, you're feeling like this iman high, right? If you were a Buddhist, though, it wouldn't mean anything to you because you don't have that emotional attachment to it.
Yeah.
Similarly, if I was a Hindu and I got to go to the Ganges River, I'm sure it would be incredible. And you see people having these religious experiences. But as a Muslim, you'd be like, yeah, it's a river. It's just the river and there are people there. So there's a lot about religious symbolism, I think, that's more ingrained in the human psyche than anything that actually happens. Because if you look at the Kaaba, for example, no one can disagree that it's a box. It's just a stone box. There's even a hadith, like this isn't even disrespectful. There's a hadith where, it's quoted as saying, to kill a believer is a bigger thing with Allah than to destroy the Kaaba stone by stone. Right? That's a hadith. But look at how many Muslims are killed all the time. It's like, people die. But if someone were to destroy the Kaaba stone by stone, my God, like imagine the war that we would be in trouble for. And that's because we attach so much importance to these symbols, these things.
Yep, it's human nature, right? And the same kind of projection, I guess, applies towards the original Sahabi and the companions, and again, you have the common Muslim that has a very sanitized, romanticized version of history where they believe, the companions did no wrong, could do no wrong, and then sometimes when you read the books, you start to see a totally different picture than what most common, and some common Muslims will even deny some of the things because they just never heard them, right?
Yeah, so I think you raise a really good point there, because I think for your average Muslim, Islam just means good, right? So obviously, if there's a Sahabi, a companion of the Prophet, they were just good,
Yeah.
right? And to them as well, kufr just means bad. So disbelief is just bad. So they're going to say, well, the Muslims were the good guys, the kuffar were the bad guys. And it's almost a simplistic 7-year-old, like Rambo understanding of the world where you have the good guys on one side and the bad guys on the other side. And to your point, when you read, even amongst themselves, there was a lot of drama going on. There were a lot of problems happening. And you start to understand that they were people. Yeah, they were people just like us. And this, this is a discussion that would probably get you into some trouble in certain circles to say that the companions were just people, but you can't read about them and not see it. You can't read about them and not see that they had problems just like you do. They were dealing with the situation in a certain social context that doesn't really exist anymore. So it doesn't really make sense. And I think that's where Muslims often run into problems, because we're looking backwards to the 7th century of this backwater corner of Arabia, of all places, for solutions to the modern world. And it's like, oh my God, no. And the irony here is that so many things that we, for example, take for granted, like equality, feminism, I'm sure you've heard people say things like, oh, Islam gave women rights. It's like, come on, man. Let's not kid ourselves. Like, you can read it and see what's actually there. It's not really the most empowering thing for women. Like, you might find a couple of good things in there, but it's not really the best. Slavery, for example, we've done away with slavery for a while, and I don't think that anyone's really advocating bringing it back. But we know that Muhammad owned slaves. Like, it was a part of their life. It's what they did. Killing, beheading people who disagree with you. Any Muslim today would look at ISIS, for example, and say, oh no, this isn't Islam. But you don't have to dig far into the books to see how many examples of people asking, Ya Rasulullah, can I cut off his head? Those kinds of things that were common to see, and it happened. So for me, at least, I remember reading this. Someone had written this, and they said, I had to make a decision. And I realized that I had my own morals and my own values, and Muhammad had his own as well. And we didn't always line up. So at the places where we lined up, I could agree. And the places where we don't line up, I'm free enough to say, yeah, I just don't agree. I don't need to defend it. There's so many things I don't need to defend. And that's freeing, I think, for you as a person. And it helps you see things more clearly in terms of just dealing with humans and human nature.
Absolutely. Before we jump on another topic, what do you think of the wall? Like, we're living in unprecedented times. We have this, virus, coronavirus, that is causing a lot of, like, it's making us do a lot of things differently that we haven't done before. And, along the same sort of, discussion we're having about how people have this idealized, romanticized version of religion, we're seeing Tawaf has been canceled for the first time. And it looks like they've started it again, but it was stopped for some time. Now, it was just announced that Hajj may be canceled again for the first time in anyone that's alive. None of us have ever experienced this in our lives, neither us nor our parents, nor our grandparents, right? So, like, supposedly there were a couple of times where there was, we were discussing this on Facebook, where the Hajj was either canceled or very small numbers were able to do it. But like in today's modern world, this is like unheard of. And Muslims seem to be dealing with it in very different ways. Some of them are like acknowledging that this is shocking to them, and others are like, whatever happens, and then there's people that are refusing to stop, and they're refusing to change their habits. Thankfully, this is not the majority of Muslims. Majority of Muslims are very much agreed that I think the vast majority, at least the ones I know, anyways, they're like, okay, we're not gonna go to the mosque for Jumu'ah. But there's, like today I saw on Facebook someone posted that in Toronto, where there's like a very high percent of Muslims living, like we're talking like a very high percent of Muslims living here, like almost 100% of the school is Muslim, like almost 100%, like extremely high number of Muslims. And in this area, they're still having they're having secret Jummah prayers in the houses, in the apartment buildings, and like putting everybody at risk. So now the good thing is other Muslims are actually catching this, and they're going to report it. But like there's a conflict there, and it's not just Muslims. Christians are having the same sort of conflict too, where some churches are like, oh, Jerry Falwell's university is open, or his school or whatever. They don't care. They're just like, God will keep us safe, right? Like,
Yeah. So here's the deal. I mean, there's a lot I could say about this actually, because I really I've thought about this a lot. A couple of things. Number one, I guess if there's ever an opportunity to give kudos to the Saudi authorities, I'm
yeah,
glad that they've done the things that they've done, because
yeah,
things could have gotten a lot worse given how packed that area is around the Kaaba and how you're dealing literally with people from basically every country. So it was a good and mature move on their part. But I think more broadly than that, it speaks to just the nature of religion's way of taking you out of current problems and having you live in this sort of fantasy world. Because in the real world, we're dealing with the coronavirus and it's a problem. And if you're around someone that's contagious, you're probably going to get it because of how contagious it is. In the religious world, though, potentially not for everyone, but in the religious world, for some, Allah will protect you. You know, in Iran, I saw, you've probably seen these videos of these guys like licking the shrine and saying, "Oh, we're gonna be fine."
yeah,
No, you're not. You're gonna die, like
yeah,
just like anyone else that catches the virus,
yeah,
right? So, but a problem is that, for example, if you read through the Quran, there are many examples of miraculous things happening, of things that people will read about and say, like, well, if you just put your trust in Allah and you believe, then you're going to be okay. That's a message that's reinforced.
yeah. And there's
So
even like examples like Khalid bin Walid said Bismillah and drank. I mean, this is a famous story that all Muslims tell each other about Khalid bin Walid, the warrior, the sword of Allah. He said Bismillah and he drank the poison and he didn't die. Of yeah, like what
yeah,
you're saying,
so,
right? I mean,
so to that point, and I think because you have to understand that in that context, in the religious context, there probably weren't a lot of cures. So anything that you could
yeah,
give people to
yeah,
ease anxiety was good, and we know that this works. The placebo effect works. So I mean, I don't know about you, but like my one of the things that I remember a lot about my childhood was the taste of black seed oil
mhm.
and those kinds of things, right? Because they just believe that there's a cure in it.
Mhm.
And yeah, sure, if you have like a headache and you take some black seed oil, then after a while the headache goes away. See, there's a cure. When
Yeah,
you're dealing with a viral infection, though, it's not going to work.
yeah,
It's not a proven cure. Like, I know your book says it's a cure, but it's just not.
yeah,
So when you have these people that are living in this kind of alternate reality and they're taking everything that they know from the book, it ends up impacting, I think, their identity as well. So now my identity is tied to this. And you talked about how shocking it has been for some people to have seen the Kaaba empty. Like, for
yeah,
some people, that's an apocalyptic sight,
mhm. Yeah,
because their minds can't handle it. So what do? Do you go and say, "Hey guys, we're just dealing with a real world problem. This is a real world solution," or do you believe in the book and say, "No, we have to do this. We have to do it"? And that's really where that fanaticism comes in. Interestingly enough, you said that was one of the first times in living memory. I'm
yeah.
sure you've heard about the Juhayman incident in Saudi Arabia as
Oh
well.
yeah, yeah. The Mahdi.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, yeah. But it goes to show you this fanaticism and what can happen when people just put this blind belief in something. Because here's the thing: it's easy to look at those guys now
yeah.
and say,
So
like, "Oh, well,
basically,
they
what
were."
happened is just because probably people don't know what we're talking about.
Mhm.
This was when this man claimed to be the Mahdi, not the Messiah, the what's how do
the
you
the
translate?
rightly guided one, or yeah, the
Yeah,
guided one, I guess, like the
someone that
one that
comes
it's
near
a
the end of
prophecy.
time, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. And he
yeah,
took away the Kaaba. He snuck weapons in, and what happened? He killed a bunch of people, and
yeah. There were a lot of people that died. So this is not that long ago either. This is 1979, and even when I lived in Saudi Arabia, and even outside of Saudi Arabia, you would talk to people that whisper about it, like, "Yeah, I remember when that happened, and this is what it was like for me." But yeah, basically, there was a guy, and the thing is, it was following sources that were essentially authentic. So there are, a hadith, there are statements of the Prophet Muhammad where he says things like, "Oh, the Mahdi is going to come and he's going to have my name, and his dad is going to have my dad's name, and he's going to bring the earth back to justice and all this kinds of stuff," right? So again, this idea of huge social change. So Saudi Arabia, in a lot of ways, Arabia in general, I think, was basically a time capsule for a very long time, where things didn't change a lot in terms of people's way of life
it's a
and
time
their belief
capsule.
systems.
That's
It is.
amazing.
And then suddenly they're jolted into the modern world.
Yeah.
I remember I had a teacher in Saudi Arabia. He said, he was talking about his mom or some person in their family. She would only watch TV with hijab on because she was worried that the people on the other side of the TV would see her.
Oh wow.
Right. So
Yeah.
it was a strange thing. They're also like not like there are stories about people in Riyadh, for example, that didn't ride bicycles when they first came out because
Mhm.
they weren't sure. They thought maybe it was the devil's invention. So you've got these people that were in a really different type of society. Suddenly they're jolted into the modern world. And there's a lot of money coming in. There's a lot of modernity coming in. And they have a book saying, hey, when this happens, be prepared for the end of time and start looking for this Mahdi guy. So for us, we can look at it now and say, oh yeah, they were just a bunch of fanatics. It was crazy. But there were actually a lot of religious students that were a part of that movement. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, Juhayman and Muhammad, I forget his Rutaibi, I think his name was, or something like that. I'll have to look it up. But anyway, these were the two guys that really led the whole movement. They had sat with a lot of the high-ranking religious scholars in Saudi Arabia. Not just like, run-of-the-mill backwater scholars, but like high-ranking religious scholars. So this stuff had some kind of legitimacy to it from a religious standpoint.
Yeah.
And I would say the same thing is true with ISIS. There's a lot that they did that was terrible, but unfortunately, there's a lot that they did that all you have to do is open the books.
Yeah.
And you can see where they're drawing their inspiration from. I'm not saying that's the only interpretation, but it is an interpretation. And I think that, Muslims would do better to admit that.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think that's a difference between what we're saying and what, you have three camps of people. You have Muslims, believing Muslims. You have, let's say, Sunni Muslims specifically, because obviously Ismailis and Ahmadis and others would already have other reasons to condemn ISIS. Then you have the far right, let's just call them that, and then you have us, right? So Muslims will say ISIS has nothing to do with Islam. Nothing to do with Islam. Not Islam at all. Then you have the far right will say this is the Islam, right? Islam. This is Islam.
This is it. Yeah, this is the only possible interpretation of Islam that exists.
This is the true interpretation. And you're a fake Muslim because you're not doing what this people are doing, right? And I think that's as absurd to say that. And in my circle, ex-Muslim circle, and people that want to attack Islam, this is more common, this sort of perspective, which I'm against completely, right? And then you have the ones in the middle, like people like us, who are saying it's not the only way to look at Islam, but unfortunately, it is one of the Islams out there, which is based on an interpretation of the primary sources, right?
And this is something I think you and I will agree upon. You can look at a religion a lot of different ways. You can look at a lived, practiced religion and just say that that's the religion. So, for example, Christianity today. There's not going to be anyone in their right mind that's going to be looking through the Bible and holding Christians accountable to like Leviticus, for example. Like even Christians themselves will say like, yeah, that's not really for now.
Yeah.
But even, more different things. I mean, you'll find Christians, for example, that are in support of gay marriage, and they'll say, well, Jesus never really spoke about it. And you'll also find Christians that say, pardon me to any of my homosexual friends, but, God hates the F word. Right. You'll see both extremes, and it's easy for us to understand that, it's not that one thing is completely alien to Christian ideology and the other thing is true Christianity. It's that it's an idea, and ideas spread and they evolve and they have different contexts. And this is another thing, if we bring it back to just my journey with Islam, seeing that there are so many different Islams. So, you're traveling throughout the Middle East, for example, even if you just stay in Arabia, in Saudi Arabia, you have this what we call commonly the Wahhabi ideology. But that wasn't always the prominent ideology, for example, in Hijaz, where Mecca and Medina are on the western side of the country. They tended to be a little bit more liberal, for sure, up until for example, anyone can Google these images. If you look at Medina, where the Baqiyah cemetery is, which is the famous cemetery in Medina where the companions are buried and stuff, for a long time, there were these gigantic mausoleums built. They look like the Taj Mahal almost, like these beautiful buildings built, because that interpretation of Islam didn't see a problem with, for example, visiting graves and so on and so forth. The Wahhabis came along though, and they had their own proofs in their hadith that say, like, don't pray towards the grave, or don't have any glorified grave structure and let you destroy it. It's a hadith. So they have their interpretation. They come and knock the stuff down.
Yeah.
And then if you go over east to Oman, you have Ibadi people, and they're like another little sect that do their own thing and have their own interpretations. Obviously, in the eastern side of Saudi Arabia today, even you have a huge Shia population that follow, Shia Islam. In Yemen, you have, I believe, some Ismaili populations there and some Zaydi populations there. So this idea that Islam has ever been one thing is just absolute ridiculousness. It doesn't bear any resemblance to reality. So for you to go back in a book and say, but see, it says that here. It's like, you think that people haven't been reading these books for 1400 years? It's an idea. It's going to evolve with different places. It's going to change.
Yeah.
It's going to be as extreme, really. And you can really find it. Today, I found Muslims that I agree with on basically every point, except for like minor things about like the existence of God and the creation of the universe and how that could have been possible without a first cause, like really abstract stuff, right? But apart from that, they're completely liberal. And then you've got, on the other end of the spectrum, you got your Salafis that are, dressed in black and for their women, and men have beards. So I guess what I'm saying is that like anything, there's plurality of practice and plurality of belief. And it's a mistake to think that it's all one thing. And if you're going to approach it that way, you're going to fail because you're not dealing with what the reality actually is.
Well said. Well said. So, so in Saudi, you had this. We were just discussing. We had this guy that came and took over the Kaaba, and said he was a Mahdi. And like you said, there actually was a religious text that caused people to actually believe in him. But of course, he was killed by the government, I guess, right?
Yeah, thanks for bringing me back to that. Actually, I got on a little tangent. We kind of got off of that. But I was mentioning that just to say, I remember when I first learned about that, I was shocked. Because even for me, I was thinking, wait, how would Allah allow the Kaaba just to be like hijacked like this and have all these people killed? And what's going on here? How did this happen? So I actually became really intrigued by the story. I read a lot about it. Like anyone that could tell me about it, I wanted to hear about it. Just because as a Muslim, the Kaaba is, we're all taught that it's this safe place and whoever goes there is safe and it's sanctified and so on and so forth. That's not true. There have been many examples in history where, invasions occurred and pilgrims were massacred, bodies were thrown into Zamzam well, and there were different outbreaks of different sorts of diseases. Even now in Hajj, there are outbreaks of what do you call it? Stampede.
Right?
Huh?
Yeah,
that was a scare a while ago. There were stampedes a while ago. There were fires. So this idea that it's this great peaceful place is, it's just not true. Like it doesn't bear any resemblance to what truly goes on.
And then there was locusts that came to, which there was the which is kind of like from the perspective of it's a punishment. Locusts are used as a punishment, which is kind of funny.
What I really liked about that incident, not that I like punishments or anything, but it coincided with Rahaf al-Qanun. Remember that girl? I believe her name was. When she had first escaped from Saudi Arabia. So I was thinking, I was like, maybe the locusts are a punishment for the way you guys are dealing with this. Not that I really believe that, but there is this tendency amongst Muslims oftentimes to look at natural phenomena and to say, oh, well, this is a punishment. Or this is happening because of that. And I think that's human nature. We're always looking for cause and effect as a species. And in a lot of ways, for me now, today, I believe that that's how religions truly it evolved, because religions didn't just start. And regardless of what your religion is. So, for example, if you're a Muslim, you know that your religion borrowed heavily from Christianity, which in turn borrowed heavily from Judaism, which in turn was heavily influenced by ideas of Zoroastrianism and the different Greek philosophies that were going on, Babylonian influences. So no idea just kind of comes out of nothing. They grow, they evolve, they change, they move into different regions and they evolve even further. So it's common for people to look for this kind of cause and effect thing. And we're hearing it now with the coronavirus. The coronavirus was caused because of Muslims in China being oppressed. But then when it canceled Hajj, it's like, oh, shoot, what do we say now? And to me, the easier approach is to say there's no supernatural element going on. Science doesn't really care about what you believe or don't believe. You just have to observe what's truly going on. And what's going on is that the Muslim will get sick just as easily as the non-Muslim. It's going to spread to countries that don't take the precaution seriously. It'll do better in countries that do take it seriously. And that's just scientific.
There's definitely a cultural sort of aspect to it, in that certain cultures which are like certain cultural practices, for example, the Chinese and the vet food markets is a big problem, and that's something we as humans should deal with, right? I mean, this has to stop. Honestly, this is dangerous for all of us, right? And obviously, I think China has some blame to play in this as well, because of how they handled it, and they didn't allow the information to come out to the Chinese people until it was too late and it was spreading. I mean, they censored it on the WeChat. Even doctors were not able to speak about this openly, because of course the main chat platform was it basically deletes the message and doesn't tell you it was deleted, so you don't even know that the other guy doesn't even know that there was a message coming. So there's all that, and then there's also the cultural fact about like religious beliefs, like for example Italy, Spain, and of course America, and very touchy-feely societies.
You're right.
And of course, like Tablighi Jamaat is
Mhm.
now like as a religious sort of phenomenon, as a movement that does dawah. I shouldn't put my hand in quotation marks, but they do dawah. That's what they believe, that spreading the religion. The reason I put it in quotes is because both me and you we were both like Salafi leaning, and so the Tablighi Jamaat is like a fake dawah because it's not the proper dawah.
Yeah, that's a whole different topic, but yeah, you're absolutely right.
So these cultural practices cause the virus to be more effective, right?
Mhm.
Like Tabligh Jamaat, and again, they're also being stoneheaded, and they're also defying all sorts of common sense. They're more dogmatic, in the same way that Salafis are. They're also being dogmatic about like, we don't care. We're gonna like still go sleep in the mosque, and we're still gonna go have this giant. And so the
Yeah,
virus has spread to
that's good. In Malaysia, I think the same thing happened as well. I read
yes,
that there was
yes,
a huge gathering that happened in Malaysia, and a lot of people got sick from it. And that's the thing. Like when you're thinking that there's this hand of God controlling things, and it's the most bizarre concept to me to think that God is looking at, for example, elderly people, elderly Muslims, even. If you're a Muslim and you're looking at that, he's looking at some sheikh somewhere saying, "Ha, you're going to die a miserable death because of the Uyghurs." Like, what are you talking about?
yeah,
So, but when you take that away, when you take that thinking away, what scientific thinking allows you to do and what critical thinking allows you to do is to observe just what's really happening. Hey, how does this thing spread? Is it
yeah,
airborne? How can you get infected? What are the things that you can do in order to avoid it? And it doesn't really matter whether or not that conflicts with your own personal like feelings and beliefs and
yeah,
those sorts of things. So if kissing on the black stone is a bad idea, the black stone can harbor a virus just as much as any other stone.
yeah.
So you just
And
have to know that.
something a lot of people don't know is you were mentioning that the Blackstone is actually only very small fragments of it is still the original.
Yeah, so this goes back to one of the things that we were talking about earlier. Again, the amount of times that Mecca has been attacked. There was one time when it was attacked, the Blackstone was stolen. It was absent from the Kaaba for years, in fact. And they said that when they brought it back, they just basically threw the bag and threw it back, and it shattered. So now what's there now are just the little fragments that they could put together, and it's sealed together. So again, I'm sorry, I have like a kind of a weird sense of humor, but I often imagine like how many people are there trying to kiss the black stone and they think they got it, but they just missed it. So now they still have all their sins because they didn't get forgiven for getting the right little piece.
But the
But
intention is what counts.
their intention was right, so maybe they're okay. But it's those sorts of things that I think that show the man-made nature of so many of these things. And if it were any other, and this is another thing that for me, if I bring it back to myself and my own journey, having conversations with people from other religious traditions and seeing just how much they believed their religion, to me, it seemed nonsensical because I could just see that it was nonsense.
Mhm.
But for some folks, so to someone else, a black stone that cures your sins and that used to be white and then turned black because of the sins of mankind, you can understand that it's nonsense if you're not in it. But when you're in it and when that is your myth, you're protective of it, you believe it. But if you were to talk to, for example, a Sikh person, the Sikh religion, and you look at, for example, the Golden Temple, to me, it's just a building. Like I don't have any emotional attachment to it. So it's not the holiest place in the world to me.
Mhm.
But to my Sikh friends, that would be the holiest place in the world. You look at something like the Ganges, it's a river. It's like someone telling me that the Mississippi is holy. I'm not going to believe that. It's a river, right?
Yeah, and
But
then people are taking baths in it, and it's
yeah,
actually dirty. Like
yeah,
there's
cremating bodies and dumping the bodies into it. So again, from our perspective, we can see it as, wow, this is something really strange. You're burning bodies and dumping them into a river and then
Mhm.
bathing in it. What's happening here? But with the religious blinder, it makes sense. So,
Yeah,
what I would challenge my Muslim friends to do is to think about, the things in our religion or in, our former religion that just don't really make a lot of sense. Like you're going to spend all this money to go to Arabia to throw stones at a pillar. What is happening here? What are you doing? And then you're going to kill a sheep or have one killed for you. Why
yeah,
are we killing animals like this? Why are we doing this? What is happening?
yeah, absolutely. Um, in many ways, like more than anything else, this virus has shown the man behind the curtain, right? Like the man that's, you know, pretending, like the Wizard of Oz basically is the analogy I'm trying to make. The Wizard of Oz analogy, where there's this man behind the curtain, why you people, and he has this deep voice and this, you know, and he's doing all these magical things. But then when the curtain drops, it's just a guy there with some like levers he's pulling, and you know.
And that's a difficult thing for people to think about. And I think that, again, these images of the Kaaba being empty might help. Because, you know, you go there and you see, and it's this beautiful building with minarets and millions of people around it and so on and so forth. But empty, you just see it as a box. It's just a little stone box that's there.
Yeah.
And again, you know, I can say that without the sense of reverence. But even from a Muslim perspective, even Muhammad himself said, like, there's a, you know, for example, if you think about the famous speech that he gave in Arafat, like on the final pilgrimage, when he said, know that your lives and your money and your honor are more important, are just as sacred as, you know, this city in this town on this day. So in other words, what it was really about, I think from his perspective, wasn't really about like the different rocks. You know, and for me, even personally, I had this thought even when I was a Muslim. You know, this is one of the benefits of being a Wahhabi. They get a lot of slack for like destroying a lot of the holy sites. But I remember I was talking to one of my sheikhs about this, and he was mentioning. He said, "Listen, think about it." He said, "The Kaaba is made out of stones. It's just stones, and then the jamarat, the things that we throw the rocks at, those are just made out of stones too. So why do we venerate this stone and then stone that stone? What's the difference?" It's just about belief. It's just about, you know, what, yeah, that's all it is.
Yeah.
So there's really nothing special about any of it. And then once you remove that emotional attachment that you have because of indoctrination or because of zeal, then you kind of, to your point, see that man behind the curtain.
Yeah. And I think what you were saying about, you know, how humans love to find cause and effect, and this is how religions work in many ways. I think that's very true, because there's been a study, there's a beautiful article on Aeon about dopamine, and basically how it's called the dopamine effect. Dopamine is one of the chemicals in the brain that we find people that are high in dopamine. You know, they think Joan of Arc was probably high in dopamine. Muhammad was probably had high dopamine levels. You tend to see, and I have a family member who has, I believe, has high dopamine as well. People that are conspiracy theorists tend to have high dopamine. They find cause and effect everywhere. Now, you know, they did a study where they actually tested this, and they grouped people into people that were high dopamine and low dopamine. The people that, and they had this picture, you know, like the one with the blots, right? And it's just like, it's like an abstract picture. It was an abstract picture that had some actual like shapes in it that, you know, looked like a cat or whatever. And the people that were high in dopamine, they found all of them, and they found some that weren't even actually there. So they were seeing things. The skeptic group missed some of the shapes, but they also didn't fall for the false flags, right? You can say. So it seems like us humans, we have this natural sort of tendency towards either being a believer or actually being a skeptic, and that's, I think, it's hardwired inside of us, you know.
I think in addition to that, you know, that's really interesting that you bring that up, because it reminds me of something that I saw that was really similar, and it spoke to the power of narratives. Humans love a good story, like we do. Like, think about it. I'm sure many of us are probably binge watching something on Netflix now. Like, we like a good story, and that story has to make sense. A lot of that has to do with the way that we learn. We learn through observing other people and through, you know, through telling the story. But I guess the false flag that occurs is that we end up telling stories when those stories aren't really there. And I saw a study that was similar to the one that you mentioned, where they showed people just a group of dots, and the dots were randomly just going across the screen. And then they asked people, like, what do you see? And it was so crazy to see people saying, like, oh, that dot's trying to get away from that dot because that dot probably, and they're making up a story about these dots moving on a screen. But it's what we do. And I think, you know, there are a lot of benefits to this sort of thinking as well. Obviously, the ability to tell a story teaches people what happens, but also it's safer for me to assume agency on the part of any sort of natural phenomenon. So if I'm out in the woods and I hear some sort of ruffling, and I think, oh man, that's a jinn, and I'm scared, so I stay inside, I'm going to survive.
Yeah.
Right? But not because I believed that it was a jinn, but because if it were something that could actually attack me or kill me, that fear works. It's like your kids. I'm sure your kids, did your kids ever go through this thing where they believed in like monsters and stuff?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm still scared of the dark.
Well, it's a common thing, right? So you're like, it's common because think about it from a child's perspective. This monster, it doesn't matter if it's there or not, but if you have a child that's naturally afraid of like shadows moving in the dark or like furry objects,
Yeah,
that child is going to survive and stay
yeah,
put and stay next to their parent and not
yeah.
wander off. So
Mhm,
for me,
mhm.
I see evolution in everything. I see evolution in ideas. I see evolution in nature. I see evolution in human progress. And I think that things that evolve survive, and that's what you're left with. And you can almost reverse engineer how they got there. And I think you can do the same thing with religion. You can see how it got there if you're willing to kind of detach yourself from it and study it more objectively.
I think the idea of natural selection is such a powerful idea. It's a meta idea. It's an idea about how ideas and how, like we became the way we are. And the more I learn about, quirks of human nature, the more I'm amazed by the evolutionary explanation. I mean, I know
Mhm.
evolutionary psychology is still a kind of young field compared to like some of the other,
Yeah,
evolutionary science there, but it's astounding. Like some of the examples that, I could just give one example. For example, postpartum depression,
yeah,
which is a very strange thing if you're a believer. Actually, any suffering in the world, I mean, any
is
suffering in the world is very strange if you're a believer, especially unnecessary suffering, because what would be the point of God inflicting unnecessary suffering on any creature if that's like the test is a test, there's a test of life. Of course, there's going to be some suffering, but the
mhm.
unnecessary suffering that has no real gain, for example, a deer that dies in a forest fire that was caused by lightning, like,
Or a baby that dies 24 hours after being born.
yeah, there's so much suffering in our world. There's such a large quantity of it that it begs the question: is there really any God out there? And if he was, why did he allow this to happen? So postpartum depression is kind of a weird thing, where
Mhm.
after a woman has a baby, for a small period of time she feels sad and sometimes even feels hostile to the child, and like she wants to harm the child. This is like a very real universal experience. Like
Mhm.
it happens to everybody. It's not like crazy women. It's everybody.
Yeah, it's a thing. Oh, absolutely. It's a thing.
Yeah, and I was reading a book that actually explained that one of the reasons why we probably have this is because in our evolutionary past, there was times where we had to decide whether we wanted to actually keep this baby because of limited resources. So
Mhm.
you have a family. There's no child. There's no way to stop having a baby because there's no contraceptives. So you just keep having kids, and now you have a kid that you don't know what to do with because you don't have resources. So the human being that was that had this tendency, even a small one, it became amplified through the selection process, would be more likely to survive, right? Not
Yeah.
having an extra child to care for, which sounds rough, right? But our history is rough, right? I mean, there
It's
was
it.
times that humanity was almost completely wiped out. I mean, genetic history shows that it was a small bottleneck, and all of us survived and reproduced from this small group, right? So it's such a
Yeah.
powerful idea,
You know what? Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think to me, that's really where I find the wonder in these sorts of things too, because to me, it really is incredible. And there's so many different topics that we could go on that really have their premise in evolution by natural selection, not just even life, but even ideas evolve,
Me.
societies evolve, things, that's the way the world works. And that to me is more wondrous than trying to explain things with some kind of God that is up there calling these bizarre shots that
Yeah.
really make no sense. And I think that's a topic that we could probably dive into quite a bit because with the religious mind, you're forced into things are a test, things are a punishment, or I just don't know and God knows best.
Yeah.
And that might be fulfilling for some people, but when you shift outside of that mindset, you're like, oh well, hold on, wait a second. There's a way better way of explaining this whole thing that really does make a lot more sense, and that's more engaging, and most importantly, allows you to predict into the future what kinds of things could happen as well. You
But
know,
with Islam, you can predict. Anytime there's a new discovery, it's always predicted that it was in the Quran.
it was in the Quran. It was in the Quran. And I'm sure evolution. There are Muslims who say that evolution was in the Quran, and I guess that's the thing too. Like for me, if that works for you, like when I was a Muslim and I was going based on what was in the text, eventually it becomes unbelievable. And I'll admit, go through a stage where I was looking at other Muslims saying, hey, it's right here in the book. How come you're not believing this? And people would give me these fantastic explanations for things that just didn't satisfy me. So what I'm really arguing for and proposing isn't that we eliminate belief. It's that we allow people to believe what they actually believe. A lot of times people say like, hey, ex-Muslims, why do you spend so much time talking about Islam? It's like, well, I was a Muslim, like just like you are. So I'm sure you spend that time talking about Islam. Like I'm going to do the same thing. But I just will allow myself to actually say what I believe. And if I believe something and it makes sense to me, I'll say, that makes sense to me. I believe it. And if I don't, I'm not going to pretend to believe something that truly doesn't make sense to me. So if there are things that make sense to you and you can work around the mental gymnastics, more power to you, man. Just give other people the freedom to do the same thing.
Absolutely. That's such a good point, that this is why one of the reasons why you wanted to come and talk as well, right? Is you just wanted, you said to me that if more people can do this and it becomes that much easier for everyone else and it normalizes, the whole process becomes normalized. And that's what we want, right?
And again, precisely. And I think that this is one of my biggest problems with Islam. And people often say like, hey, what was the thing that really made you leave? A lot of these issues weren't really the main thing that made me leave. But once I realized that, hey, I don't really believe X, Y, and Z anymore, and that might be considered kufr, or I don't really find this explanation palatable anymore, and that might be considered kufr, or I don't believe that Muhammad acted ethically in this situation, and that might be considered kufr. At that point, you realize you don't really have a choice. You believe it or you don't. Like, you can't make yourself believe things that you don't really believe.
Yeah.
So what we're looking for is the freedom to be able to come out and just say, hey, guys, I don't really believe that. And the more of us do that, I can't imagine how many people are having these same thoughts. I mean, there's, like I was mentioning earlier about Arabia kind of being a time capsule for a long time. And in many ways, Islam was a time capsule. I remember a time not very long ago when the idea of evolution was obviously incompatible with religion. And there were imams, plenty of them, that would just say, evolution is not true. It's a lie. It's a Darwinian theory. It's not real. As the evidence for evolution grew, though, suddenly it's compatible with religion, and suddenly it's okay, and so on and so forth. There's so many different examples of that. I remember a time when the punishment for apostasy was death. And there's a hadith that says it, and that's just what people believed. Now, though, oh no, it's not exactly that. It's treason. So even those ideas are evolving before our very eyes, because if they didn't, they would die. So.
Yeah, that's exactly true. And so what was it that caused you to, I mean, we haven't talked about this, but what was it that caused you to kind of leave Islam, to see the man behind the curtain as just a man?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say that there's one thing. There were a lot of things. And for me, I always wanted to learn more. And I believed it. So, and I think a lot of Muslims probably struggle with this as well, to say, if I don't understand something, the problem must be with me. And Islam, it has a strange relationship with questions, because on the one hand, it tells you, use your reason, think, ask a scholar if you don't know, like those kinds of things are kind of pushed. But at the same time, it's like, hey, you're asking too many questions. Just say, I believe, say, I hear and I obey. But again, you're like, but I still don't have the answer. I'm still struggling with this thing. So I think, there were a ton of issues. I mean, one of them was the overwhelming evidence for evolution by natural selection, and the really unimpressive mental gymnastics that I found many Muslims engaging in. And even today, you'll find two camps. You'll find Muslims who believe that, oh yeah, you can believe in evolution for all other creatures except for humans, because humans are a special creation by Allah. And that's kind of like saying, yeah, you can believe that all dogs evolved from wolf ancestors except for poodles. You have to believe that poodles were magically created by a fairy. It's like, wait, hold on. The same evidence that exists there exists here. So why are we doing? Also, there are a lot of ethical things, I think, and I won't go into a lot of detail, but, if you study the life of Muhammad, you'll find a lot of things that will make you question, in terms of the ways that he treated women, the ways that he treated his enemies, the ways that he treated critics. And those are things just me, I don't personally agree with. So I'm not going to defend it if I don't agree with it. Aisha and her age, obviously. I remember a time when Aisha was actually 6 years old. Yeah. And then she was 9 years old when she consummated. That was the traditional approach. Yeah. And then now we're having people, oh no, she was 18. She was closer to 25. It's like, wow, where were you guys 30 years ago? Like, when did this happen?
Yeah.
So all these kinds of things that for a long time build up on you. But the thing that really did it, and I've shared this maybe once or twice, but never like this. There was one day I was driving in my car, and it was between Asr and Maghrib, so the afternoon prayer and the evening prayer. And there are some Muslims who believe that if you miss a single prayer without a valid excuse, it could be considered disbelief. So I'm sitting in my car and there's a traffic jam, and I'm back in America at this time, and the sun's just starting to go down, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm not going to make Asr prayer. I'm like, what do I do? I'm like, do I stop the car and get out? Do I just wait? I was like, this is on my mind. I'm not forgetting it, so I can't just say I forgot. I'm not asleep. This is me deliberately making a choice not to pray. And I'm like, whoa, that might be disbelief. And then I start looking around at all the different cars around me, and everyone around me is not a Muslim. And I realized that I was the only one in that traffic jam that was having that problem.
Yeah.
Like no one else cared that the sun was going down. It wasn't that big a deal for anyone else around. So I just started thinking to myself, like, wait a second. So you mean to tell me that all of these people here are just going to be tortured pointlessly and endlessly for having the wrong religion? Or even, if Muslims say that, maybe they're not for whatever reason, there's still plenty of verses in the Quran that say that many people won't believe. There's a verse where it says that hell will be filled with mankind and jinn altogether. There's another verse where he says, if I wanted to, I could. This is supposedly God speaking. If I wanted to, I could have guided everyone, but I decided instead that I'm going to fill hell with people. I'm like, what kind of God is this? What is happening here? So to me, like at that point, I was like, I don't believe that. Don't believe that either. And at that point, like I just really let myself go into that place where I knew I was anyway. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't the final thing, it wasn't the first thing, but it was that kind of turning point where I was just like, you know what? None of it really makes any sense on so many different angles. And then once I allowed myself the freedom to do that, it takes a couple of days. It takes a couple of days to adjust to the new world that you're living in that doesn't have a God watching you, and everything that you do has to be judged, and blah, 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 blah. Initially, you think, oh my God, everything's going to go bad. I don't know what life after Islam can be like. And I'll admit, there are hardships, and a lot of ex-Muslims mention this. There are social hardships, and there are personal hardships. For a Muslim, the relationship that they have, and I think this is true for any believer, regardless of what your belief is, the relationship you have with your God to you is a real thing. So to start to live life in a way where that's not real anymore, it takes some getting used to, and it can be kind of traumatic because you're changing your entire way of interacting with the world and with people around you. But then socially, I was in a situation where my friends were Muslim, my family was Muslim, so on and so forth. And these are still people that I have love for. So to have this idea that they're going to see me differently now, or our relationship is going to have to change, it's difficult. So hopefully, what we can do through this process of ex-Muslims speaking more about their experiences is, number one, put a real human story to it, but also make it more normal. Because if you're a Muslim watching this, chances are an ex-Muslim already that's just not telling you. Or you're dealing with maybe you yourself, you're having a lot of questions and you're like, I don't know what to do with this, but I can't do anything. I'm paralyzed. So I think the more of us create this acceptance and this, normalizing the idea of speaking out.
Even, right?
Precise. Yeah. Even just having the conversation and normalizing the idea of having the conversation. I think that's the crazy part, is that in a lot of ways you can't even have the conversation.
Yeah.
So being able to have the conversation, I think, is extremely important. It's the first step. And we've seen immense progress, I think, in this regard. There was a time when I remember, for example, the Quranic scientific miracles was all everyone talked about. Oh, there are all these scientific miracles in the Quran. Because skeptics refuted each claim, now you have popular people saying, hey guys, maybe we want to back off of the scientific miracles thing. In so many examples. I saw this thing with Yasser Qadhi down in Texas, where they had a conversation about balancing LGBT rights with Islam. It's a conversation you would never have had 40 years ago, at least not in mainstream. There might have been some like small individual, but to have it in a mainstream masjid like that, it's an interesting conversation. And I have to say that it's because we're encouraging people to talk about these sorts of issues. And those ideas are going to evolve just like any other idea.
Totally. Do you want to talk a little, since you're involved and you've been an ex-Muslim a lot longer than I have, and you know many, many people that actually went through the same process. Do you want to talk about, or even your own struggles of leaving the religion, like the family, the effect on a family, or the effect on, the extended, like your friend circle and stuff like that? Do you want to talk about
Yeah.
that a little bit?
So I think a lot of it depends on the person. And I've heard a lot of different stories. I've heard people, for example, who today are married and their spouse is a Muslim, they're an ex-Muslim, and they figured out a way to work it out. And I've heard the opposite extreme, where the moment the person found out that they didn't believe in Islam, especially, for a married couple, they were like, well, that's it. Because in traditional Islam, if a person's an apostate, then the marriage is automatically invalidated, and
Yeah.
they have to get out of the house, and that can be traumatic. It can be huge. Imagine just saying, "Hey, just because I believe in this idea," and a lot of times it's not even a practical idea. A lot of times your day-to-day life probably doesn't change. It's just an abstract idea that you have about, like, how the world started, or what would be moral or immoral to do. That has to change your life. You have to find a new house.
Yeah.
You have to potentially move cities. You have to potentially fear that people might do you physical harm. And
Yeah.
that's a story that unfortunately I've heard more times than I wish I had to. And I can say that as a guy. I think it's even more challenging for many of our female ex-Muslims, many of the women. We know this too. That Islam is kind of lopsided when it comes to dealing with men and women, and a lot of the women have it really rough. So honestly, one of the things that even caused me to agree to talk like this publicly is just because of how, it's heartbreaking. How many times are you going to hear it?
Yeah.
How many times are you going to hear about the girl that's terrified of telling her dad that she doesn't believe, or terrified about taking hijab off, and going to school, and if people find out, they're going to shame her, and it's real and it's
Yeah.
happening. And unless we talk about it, then I was going to say the pundits, but I shouldn't say that because that's a Hindu term. I should just say the imams. The
Yeah.
imams are going to continue to portray ex-Muslims as the evil ones, the terrible ones. I saw Yasser Khalil going in on you, I think, or at least inferring that it was you, talking about, oh,
Yeah.
look at how arrogant these guys are. And you get a lot more slack about this kind of stuff than I do. But the more that we're vilified, the less people will see us as human beings.
Yeah.
And there's huge danger in people not seeing you as a human being, which is why I think humanism is truly the solution. But there's huge danger in people not seeing you as a human being. I mean, I don't even have to go into a lot of detail there, but even Islamic scriptures themselves allow for some really tough treatment of people accused of apostasy.
Mm-hmm.
Apostasy in, what is it, 17, I believe, Muslim countries today is still, a criminal offense. So far before we even get into conversations about the existence of God, or whether or not human beings were a specially created species, we have to have secularism. You have to have freedom of speech. You have to have the ability to say what's on your mind and engage in conversation. And I think that what you're doing, and hopefully what we're going to continue to do, is helping to move the ball in that direction.
Totally, totally. And one last question I have is, there's a meme that goes around that, I mean, and it's kind of true in some ways, that ex-Muslims are miserable. And the reason I say it's kind of true is because if you are actually kicked out of your family and you're 16, even worse, you're female, even worse, you have no practical skills in life because you were sequestered and treated like, future wife material, even worse. And I'm talking about like an actual person that I've read her story online. Even worse, about to be put into an arranged marriage. All of these things, like, of course, your life, like, it is true that life will be miserable when you have to leave that, but eventually, things do improve and do get better. Can you talk about that a bit? Like, what is life like
So
after?
one of the things that I find so curious is how a religion, and I won't even call it Islam, because if you start to criticize Islam, people might get defensive. So let's just say a religion. How a religion can say things like, you won't find people who are opposing our God and our messenger loving, or you won't find people who believe in our God and our messenger loving people who oppose our God and our messenger. It's so curious to me how any religion can say things like, you have to believe in our messenger and love him more than you love yourself or your kids or your family. How any religion can say, if you criticize us, then your blood is okay for us to spill. Any religion that might say that, right? And then can also say, hey, if you're married and your spouse, there's a verse in a certain religious book. I won't name the book because it might cause people to be defensive, but there's a verse that's certain in a certain religious book that says, as for believing women, don't let them go to their disbelieving husbands because they're not permissible for them. And they are not permissible for them. So neither one of the two can be with each other because one is a believer and the other is not. There's a book, a holy book out there that says that for you to take a slave who's a believing slave is better for you than to take someone that's not a part of our religion as a spouse. So it's mind-boggling to me how that same religion can snatch away your family, can degrade you as a person, can, to your point, put you out into a world that you really have been sheltered from and might not even know, and leave you on your own to figure that out. And then say, oh, look at you, you poor ex-Muslim, you're so depressed and so miserable. You should just come back. But the fact of the matter is, the more that we support one another, the more that we come together, the more that you realize that you're not alone. There are people that are like you. Life does get better. There are things that you have to learn. There are things that you have to do. There are adjustments that you have to make. Your entire mindset, even just the guilt, there's a certain religion that uses fear to manipulate people, the fear of hell, the fear of being punished in your grave, the fear of being rejected by your family and the people that are supposed to just naturally love you. It uses that stuff to manipulate behavior. So even that, like once you've come to the logical conclusion that that particular religion isn't true, you still have to undo some of that indoctrination that you've had, that I'm a bad person for having these thoughts. I'm an evil person for not believing. Maybe I deserve to be kicked out. And you'll hear these things from ex-Muslims, but it takes time. And again, part of the reason why I haven't spoken a lot publicly is because I feel like I can do much more good speaking to ex-Muslims and lifting us up as a community than I can debating with some random person that, wants to debate with me about whether or not God exists or blah, blah, blah. I really don't care, honestly. Yeah. Like, if that's what you want to believe, go for it. But this person over here, this ex-Muslim person over here who I can relate to their story 100%, I'd much rather support them. So we have the opportunity to do that now. And I think that we'll continue to do that. And I'll say that anyone that's questioning Islam, yeah, you're probably going to have some difficulties, but know that you're not alone. I think we're building up, and I have to give a huge shout out to ex-Muslims of North America, Council of Ex-Muslims Britain, to my Sheikh Hassan Radwan, whose videos really helped me out a lot. Like those kinds of things, I think, to you, to Abdullah Gondal, to all these people that are out there making this a thing and making it less stigmatized and giving people the freedom to be themselves. It's where we're going, and it's the direction that we're headed. And it's going to continue because Islam isn't going to get any truer with the days. Like, you might be able to figure out different ways of making it believe, but it's not getting any truer. It is what it is. It's a static text. It's a static religion. You can interpret it differently, but that's up to the individual. The text itself isn't changing. So you're going to see more and more and more of what we've been witnessing. And, if I can do my part to help, that's exactly what I'd want to do.
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to end it there. I think this was a great conversation. Thank you so much, Khalil.
Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely enjoyed the insights, and would love to have you on again. Maybe we can talk more about some of the strange things that you found in Saudi, some of the things that while you were studying, you know a lot about Salafism, way more than I do. You studied under some of those sheikhs and stuff that I think it'd be interesting to hear some of the stories. We talked a little bit about, how common the flat earth idea was in Saudi at one point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you have some unique insight, having lived there. So it'd be nice to kind of get into that. And if you can get Hassan on here as well. And
that would be great. That would be absolutely fantastic. I mean, the one thing I will say, I don't necessarily want to end on that note, because I think that Saudi Arabia even is seeing a lot of change.
Yeah.
And there are people in Saudi Arabia that are doing incredible things despite, what they've inherited in terms of ideology. So, I don't want to cast Saudi Arabia all in one light.
Sure.
It's a unique and dynamic place that, probably has some potential, but we'll see what happens.
Absolutely. That's true. There's some positive things we're seeing out of Saudi as well. I shouldn't end it on a negative note, but just saying that you definitely have a lot more interesting stories.
Yeah, for sure.
On again. Is there anything you want to share, where to find you, anything like that, or not really?
I think the people that I want to find me have found me. Okay. So the people who know me love you. Anyone looking to do me any harm, That's all
Okay,
good.
everyone. So that's it. And thank you so much, Khalil, once more. And yeah, stay tuned. And if you're new here, please subscribe. Join the channel. Link is below. Take care.
Absolutely. Take it easy.
Signing out. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoy the content on this channel, please consider supporting me. The details are linked below. This is Abdullah Samir signing out.